Well, now from immigration and climate to diversity and justice, Donald Trump's shakeup of American policy is having a dramatic impact in Washington and beyond. Our next guest, former federal prosecutor Brendan Ballou, believes the president is disregarding the rule of law. In his latest piece for Slate magazine, he writes that in Trump's first 100 days, he's ignored judges, extorted law firms, and fired lawyers. Why? Ballou says disloyalty to the president. He sits down with Michelle Martin to discuss the mass exodus from the Department of Justice, how the MAGA base might be positioning to take over the D.C. bar, and what all of this means for the law in America.
Thanks, Bianna. Brendan Ballou, thanks so much for talking with us once again.
Thank you.
So you're a former federal prosecutor, and you've been writing a lot and talking a lot about what you see as efforts to politicize major institutions, particularly legal institutions. So I just want to start with some recent news. More than 100 attorneys recently left the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division after being told the department would now be prioritizing President Trump's cultural agenda instead of previous priorities like, voting rights, policing sort of oversight. It's not unusual when an administration changes, priorities change, right? What is different about this? What is different about this that has caused this mass exodus of career employees?
Yeah. So I think that, as you said, administrations change, priorities change, and normally career staff will stick around between administrations, whether they're Democratic or Republican. I think what's different here is not just that it's a more extreme agenda. The new Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights says that she's going to go after, so-called DEI policies, anti-Christian bias and things like that. I don't think it's just the extremism of the politics, but also what this administration has messaged about the rule of law more generally. The president, the vice president, various members of the cabinet have all made clear that they don't particularly plan to follow court orders. And in fact, they already aren't. And so I think if you're a career staffer, you have to think about, do I want to be a part of an administration that doesn't necessarily respect the rule of law? And if I don't, how can I be most effective in resisting it? And I think that's what these resignations were about.
Well, what's interesting also is that this is President Trump's second stint in office, not continuous, obviously. But many of these attorneys did serve during the first Trump administration. What is it that they have said, or what is it that they have signaled that would cause people, for some of whom have served in the government for decades, to say that this is the line that I can't cross?
So I can't speak to the internal deliberations within the Department of Justice, but let's focus specifically on the Civil Rights Division. What you've seen is a dismantling of years of work by career lawyers to try to bring justice to some of the poorest and most disadvantaged people in America. You look at the settlement agreement that they reached with Lowndes County, Alabama, that would remediate the fact that historically Black neighborhoods didn't have sewage systems. That settlement was destroyed by the Department of Justice. You look at a case to prohibit discrimination in the Maryland State police force, that was dropped. A case to try to prevent discrimination within the Mississippi State Legislature, that was dropped. You're seeing years of work abandoned in a matter of weeks. And so I think for these career folks, it's obvious not just that this administration doesn't share their commitment to sort of the cause of civil rights as traditionally understood, but also doesn't particularly have a commitment to the institution of the Department of Justice, or like I said, to the rule of law more generally. And so I think when you're in that position, if you're a career civil servant, and I've been in this sort of position before, you have to think about what can you do to be most effective? Sometimes that's staying within government and trying to uphold the rule of law within it. And sometimes that's leaving as noisily as you can. And I think that's what these people decided to do.
The new Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Harmeet Dillon, said about the exodus, and en masse, dozens and now over 100 attorneys decided that they'd rather not do what their job requires them to do. I wasn't sure how to read that. I mean, in a way, I think she might be glad, because then presumably they could put people in those positions who will be more amenable to their point of view. How did you read that?
I think that at some level, they may believe that, but at another level, this may be a little bit of a brave face on the part of the administration. The only thing the Department of Justice has, the only thing that any lawyer has is their credibility. It's the credibility to persuade a judge to rule for you, the credibility to get a jury to agree with you. And if you destroy your credibility, you will not be able to accomplish things legally. And so I think when you see a mass exodus like what we saw, just a few days ago, it suggests that the Department of Justice is bleeding out its credibility very quickly. And so, yes, maybe in the very short term, this is helpful to the new administration. They can try to staff up with folks that are more ideologically aligned with them. But in the long term, I think it's going to make it much harder for them to accomplish their agenda.
I want to turn to another issue that you've been writing about. You actually wrote a piece for Slate writing about a bid for leadership between two Trump allies, Brad Bondi, who's the brother of Attorney General Pam Bondi, and Alicia Long, who's a Trump appointee. They're running to take over, as you say, the D.C. bar. Why do you think this is important? It's not just for some sort of local issue, but you think this has real importance?
Yes, I'm grateful that you asked, and I think it's a matter of national importance. So the D.C. bar is the bar association for nearly 120,000 lawyers in America, lawyers who practice inside and outside of government. And the elections matter really for two reasons. The first is that the leadership of the DC bar does play a role in the disciplining of those 120,000 attorneys. So it's not direct, but the fear is that if Trump allies are able to take over the DC bar, they could use that as a way to punish lawyers that are seen as insufficiently loyal to the administration. So that's one fear. The other fear, and I think it's much more immediate, is that in any country facing a sort of illiberal movement, bar associations historically have been voices defending democracy, defending the justice system, defending the rule of law. You see that happen in countries like Brazil and Spain a few decades ago. And the real fear here is that if the Trump allies take over the DC bar, the bar will be silenced when the government acts illegally, when the government acts contrary to the Constitution. And that's one less voice standing up for democracy and for the rule of law.
So Brad Bondi was asked about this. He says, the bar has a nonpartisan mission, which I intend to vigilantly protect against any push to politicize it. My effort to run for DC bar president began months before the federal elections and has no connection with national politics at all. And the platform of the role is sort of apolitical. I take it you don't really buy that.
Yeah, there are really two fears here. One fear is that Brad Bondi might be not being truthful about why he's running. He is the global co-chair of investigations for a major international law firm. He seems to have developed a rather sudden and passionate interest in free certificates of accreditation in the DC bar. I think that doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that normally interests a high-powered white-collar attorney. So it's possible that he's being disingenuous about why he's running. It's also possible that he's telling the truth, and that's just as scary. When he says that he wants to make the bar an apolitical organization, what that means is that they don't want the bar to speak out when the rule of law is under attack. And so, again, I think the risk here is that a credible institution, an institution that a lot of people believe in, could be silenced if Trump allies take it over.
Do you feel that, for example, there have been some sort of key players who have had their licenses revoked for misconduct, like Rudy Giuliani being one example? Is part of your concern that they would kind of potentially exonerate wrongdoers? Or is it really more that you're concerned that they would try to keep the bar from organizing itself as an entity to oppose other things going forward? Is that more your concern?
That's the latter concern is the immediate problem. The long-term concern is that the DC bar is involved in appointing the members to the board that handle disciplinary proceedings here in DC. And so over the months, over the years, those members would be replaced potentially with Trump loyalists. And so once you do that, then you have an enormous amount of power among over many thousands of lawyers that work in the government. And so it's a potential, where the administration cannot just fire an attorney that's deemed insufficiently loyal. But allies could potentially disbar that attorney and prevent them from working entirely. And that is really powerful leverage.
And that could be, how you think that could actually be seen as professional misconduct, not carrying out the will of the administration. One case that comes to mind is the attorney, there's the case of this Maryland man who was deported to El Salvador the administration acknowledged in court that it was an administrative error. He had a judicial order saying he was not to be deported to El Salvador, that he had a credible fear of, retaliation or harm if he were returned there. Okay. Now there's been this furious fight back and forth to get him back from El Salvador because his advocates have said this is not fair. He should be returned. He should never have been deported. The administration has been saying he's a bad guy. They insist he's a gang member, even though there's no evidence that's been presented to that other than some tattoos, which is disputed. Well, here's how we know that the administration admits that it was an administrative error. Their attorney said so in court when pressed. And then this lawyer in court was suspended, or at least he was moved off the case. He was suspended and criticized publicly, saying he didn't zealously advocate for the administration's position. Okay. Is that what you're worried about? Someone like that who is acting within the scope of what he considers his appropriate professional responsibility, telling the truth in court, but it's not in alignment with the administration's position, would then be literally disbarred for that?
That's the potential long-term risk. So, all lawyers have a couple of obligations. One is to zealously advocate for their client. But another, every federal government employee takes an independent oath to uphold the Constitution and also has an independent duty of candor. And so you can see how some of those obligations can come into conflict with one another. I think that case is exactly right, which is, the leadership of DOJ would have liked that lawyer to zealously advocate, presumably even if it meant eliding or distorting the truth. That lawyer, to their enormous credit, did not do that. But you can imagine a world in where Trump loyalists are able to help select members of the disciplinary board, potentially would see that as a sign of disloyalty and also as professional misconduct. So that is the long-term risk here.
People do run for the leadership of these bar associations on saying that they want to advocate for things like diversity in the legal profession, right? And so is it reasonable that somebody could also run for the head of the DC bar saying, I don't think that's your job. I think we should just stick to our knitting, which is just, I don't know, whatever they consider the core responsibility, and that's all extra stuff, and that's politics. It doesn't have any place here.
Yeah.
Is that wrong?
My argument isn't that Brad Bondi that it's inappropriate for him to run for DC bar president. My argument is that we don't want the administration loyalists running the bar. And so it's entirely legitimate for him to run. It's also entirely legitimate for people to vote against him in the election, which is open until June 4th.
So one more issue, Judge Hannah Dugan in Wisconsin. This is another case that's gotten a lot of attention. She was taken into custody by the FBI on courthouse grounds for allegedly helping a man evade ICE. Judges have been arrested before for things, but is there anything about the way this was handled that stands out to you?
Absolutely. If you look at the criminal complaint here, it seems like this was an arrest made not with the intention of securing a conviction, but for securing a headline, which this administration was enormously successful at. But the legal standard to convict the judge in this case seems far beyond what the facts warrant. And so my suspicion here is that the administration is not necessarily trying to convict this judge. Perhaps they'd like it if they could, but to try to instill a certain amount of fear in judges in a very specific way, which is that ICE agents are going into courthouses to try to detain undocumented immigrants. Presumably, judges are going to be increasingly afraid to stop ICE agents from interfering in court proceedings or from roaming the halls to try to pick up undocumented immigrants, because they too are now afraid of being arrested and charged.
So there just seem to be two very different versions of what happened here. The administration seems to be arguing that Judge Dugan escorted this man out or helped him to, evade authorities or somehow helped him get out of a side door or run away, etc. The other version of this is that she was trying to define the kind of the scope of authority. She was in a specific legal proceeding that was unrelated to this. That matter had not been adjudicated, and she felt that he deserved his day in court on that issue and was trying to preserve the integrity of that proceeding. So those are two very different things. Now that the administration has had her arrested, saying she actually broke the law, who decides that? Like, how does this get sorted out?
Well, now it's a criminal trial. So it's going to be decided by a judge, and if it ever has to go to trial, to a jury. I'll note that, you mentioned in the outset here that judges have been arrested before. This administration arrested a judge in the first term. Ultimately, that prosecution was dropped and referred to sort of a mere, professional disciplinary proceeding. So their track record in winning in these cases isn't particularly good. But the damage has already happened. This judge has already been reassigned or taken off her cases. And the message has been made very clear to judges that they are not safe from criminal prosecution in this administration.
I do have to ask, though, if the facts are as alleged by the administration and any other persons knew that someone else was being pursued by law enforcement and gave them some means of escape, wouldn't they be prosecuted?
Not necessarily. So, I haven't handled immigration prosecution, so I don't want to overstate my expertise here. But the primary statute under which she was charged requires corrupt intent, threat of force, or other kind of intimidation here, which, at least based on the allegations in the government's own documents, there hasn't been anything close to that yet. So once again, this seems like an arrest built more for headlines than for an actual prosecution.
Before we let you go, can you talk about why people should be paying attention to these issues? This seems all very technical. Can you just give us a sense of why you think it's important to pay attention to these kinds of very specific issues and these very specific prosecutions and allegations and these kinds of developments?
I would tell your viewers to not underestimate your own power here. Having been on the inside of government, I can tell you, protest, outreach, outrage really matters. It changes how people inside of government think. It changes how judges think. And so the more attention that can be brought to attacks on the Constitution, attacks on the rule of law, it empowers people inside of government to resist unconstitutional or illegal actions, and empowers judges to stand up for what's right. And so even if you don't necessarily see the exact consequence of paying attention and speaking out, I can assure you that you are having an effect.
Brendan Ballou, thanks so much for talking with us once again.
Thank you.
A lot can change in 5 years, and many people watching the January 6th insurrection on this day in 2021 might not have predicted Donald Trump's re-election. When he returned to office last January, Trump pardoned groups of supporters who stormed the Capitol after he lost the 2020 election. Pardoning the insurrectionists is just one of many actions Trump has taken since returning to office that critics call an attempt to reduce January 6th to an afterthought in American history. Philosophy professor and author of How Fascism Works, Jason Stanley, says the U.S. Supreme Court has played an outsized role in those efforts, and he joins Hari Srinivasan to discuss why.
Bianna, thanks. Jason Stanley, welcome back to the program. You are joining us on January 6th. It's the 5th anniversary of the January 6th insurrection. You served and as an expert advisor to the January 6th committee. And about a year after, you wrote that America was entering, quote, a legal phase of fascism, warning that the insurrection was being followed by legal and legislative mechanisms like rewriting election laws and restricting voting rights. Here we are now, 5 years later. Has your opinion changed?
No, and I think the Supreme Court ruling that has given the president essentially carte blanche over so-called official acts makes the situation we face even more dire, as we've seen in this past year.
I want to get to the legality of the Supreme Courts in a second, but let's talk about Venezuela. Right now, does the does the end justify the means? Because there are people that are rejoicing in Venezuela and outside who, even the Nobel Prize winner, Maria Corina Machado, she celebrated this operation. She said in a statement, as of today, Nicolas Maduro faces international justice for the atrocious crimes committed against the Venezuelan people and against citizens of many other nations. In light of his refusal to accept a negotiated solution, the government of the United States has fulfilled its promise to uphold the rule of law. I mean, is there justification in the eyes of the administration saying this was a despicable human being and he should not have been in power? We tried to negotiate an end to it, but didn't work out.
Well, what would you think if another country kidnapped President Trump, saying that he has done all these illegal things, he's not very popular, he's despotic? Obviously, that would be a violation of international law. Obviously, Maduro is horrific. Obviously, Venezuela has faced terrible things under his rule and under the prior rule of Chavez. However, none of that is an excuse, just as it would not be, Trump's misrule, Trump's open illegality would not be any kind of excuse to take out Trump. Similarly, Trump isn't suggesting at all that Putin should be taken out in any possible way. And Putin has destroyed his own country, killed hundreds of thousands of his own citizens in a pointless war, killed thousands of Ukrainians. There are plenty of despots, but what's the difference here? The difference here is that Trump can. There's oil in Venezuela, and Trump can benefit those who support him. Trump can benefit companies. Look, this connection between oligarchical interests and autocrats is well known from history and the current moment. If you support the oligarchs, if you support the autocrat, he will enrich you. So that's what we're seeing now. Presumably, there are oil companies, oil executives who are going to profit from this, as well as people close to the president. So the motivation here is clear. It's nothing to do with democracy or the betterment of the Venezuelan people. Also, Trump has used this to say he's going to target other countries. Colombia has a leftist president. He said that he's now threatening Colombia. There's no sign that Colombia is collapsing in any way. And now he's saying he's going to target Greenland. And Greenland obviously is not, Denmark has not subjected Greenland to any kind of autocratic rule.
So, you have documented and pointed out that there is a global shift towards the right. And I wonder what the actions of the United States in the past week, in the past year, what they do to other authoritarians, other despots, other dictators around the world.
Well, Trump is clearly signaling to Putin and Xi that they can do whatever they want in their local areas. And of course, his Ukraine policy has immensely favored Vladimir Putin. And now these actions are a signal to Putin that there is no international order left, that every authoritarian leader, every dictator can exert power over neighboring countries or any countries they wish to profit from. Trump is signaling that there is nothing the United States would do. In fact, the United States is taking the lead on just these kinds of actions.
The response from most people when they hear you and as you draw these parallels and these comparisons, they're going to say, look, it's not fair to compare the United States to a place like Hungary or wherever. We have these institutions that are checks and balances on the White House. So let's talk a little bit about the Supreme Courts. What layer of confidence do you have that the Supreme Court is going to be able to be any sort of a check on a rise in executive power?
None, because the Supreme Court seems fully committed to keeping this far right machine in power. So even well after Trump, we can expect the supermajority, the conservative supermajority, many of whom were appointed by presidents who are not elected by the popular vote. We can expect this conservative supermajority to legislate in such a way that keeps the machine behind Trump in power. We've seen that with the use of the shadow docket. The shadow docket, they have ruled again and again and again and again for the Trump administration. This Supreme Court was a block on the Biden administration. They halted the Biden administration's policies across the board. One of the most notable examples would be the attempt to forgive student loans. So the disparity between their relationship to the Trump regime and their relationship to the Biden administration is notable. That disparity shows that this is simply a partisan. A partisan really undersells what we're seeing here. This is the Supreme Court that's going to block anything any Democratic administration is going to do. They blocked so much of what the Biden administration was trying to do, and they're going to use the shadow docket. There's going to use various methods to simply overrule lower courts' decisions that find problems with the Trump administration is doing, and they're just going to keep handing this administration what they want, and they'll keep on doing that for whoever is in power, as long as they are on part of this far right machine. So that's a problem that's going to extend well past Trump.
Are there not lower courts that are handing losses to the Trump administration?
Absolutely, again and again. But the Supreme Court continually overrules those lower courts. So, that's our problem. That's our problem. Some future legislative action is going to have to deal with this, but it's just going to be an immense struggle because this Supreme Court stands for nothing other than a set of far right principles, and they're going to do everything they can to stymie any legislative action that will run counter to this far right agenda. So we do have the lower courts are helping. We also see that juries are helping, grand juries are helping. Some of the clear weaponization of the Justice Department has run aground in some of these cases because grand juries have refused to indict. We've seen the cases collapse. So I think several things here along the general question of institutions that you're framing here. I think that this administration thinks that no Democrat will ever be in power again. It's the only way to make sense of their actions. The only way to make sense of the actions of MAGA Republicans is that they believe that Democrats will never be in power again. However, I think that's incorrect. I think that they have overplayed their hand. I think they no longer have public opinion behind them. And I think that institutions, they haven't been able to target successfully all the people they tried to target.
This was part of the reason when we spoke last time about why you had personally chosen to move to Toronto, move to a university there, because you felt like the views that you express could be targeted.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of two minds about that. I mean, I think my move to Toronto will make sense if what I can build here, along with others at the Monk School at the University of Toronto, can help U.S. democracy. If it can be a place where people can come and we can bring people who are free to speak and free to strategize about how we can get out of this situation, and a liaison with other people from countries like Ukraine, Russia, Brazil, who have faced or do face similar situations, then the move will be positive. I think, it goes, I don't think that this regime has been successful in targeting. I mean, I think they have too many targets now, right? I mean, I think they're brutally targeting non-citizens. So many people in the United States are now wondering whether they're a target. And I think what we've seen is a normalization of that. When I go to the United States now, what I see is this very crazy situation being normalized. And people are like, see, you could have stayed. And I think I could have stayed without a doubt at this point. But, this situation where you constantly you're like, wow, legally they could target this huge swath of people. And that might include me, or definitely could include me, because I'm definitely calling the Trump administration fascists. But they can't target everyone. And there's a lot of incompetence here. So does that mean you're safe? Does it mean you're not safe? Who knows? And I think people in the United States are learning to live with that situation. And so you see this incredible normalization, which is kind of remarkable to me. There's a term that's emerging, sane washing, that I think you find the media doing. That is it's a related but different concept than normalization. Sane washing is sort of representing what this administration is doing, the extreme actions they're taking as sane, trying to find some rationale for them. The normalization seems to me something sort of more in the air when I go to the United States. People are more careful about what they say. People are sort of accepting the craziness of the situation. And the situation does seem crazy from the outside. But personally, I think, as things have emerged 1 year later, are they targeting regime critics as harshly as they could have? Not now, and the incompetence blocks them from doing it. I mean, Kash Patel is not Brendan Carr. He's not as effective of a person. The Justice Department people have not been as effective at targeting the broad swath of Americans that they've now said they can target. So I go back and forth about my decision. I mean, my decision had multiple elements. It's been very hard. It's really hard at the age of 56 to uproot yourself from your home, to separate yourself from all of your friends, to start anew in a completely new place. That has been much harder than I accepted. And I meant my decision less to be a decision about myself, more to be an expression of a political statement about the United States. And I think it was a political statement, about an effective political statement about the United States. It did express to the world, okay, when people leave, that is concerning. Probably more effective than any other political statement I've made.
We've also witnessed the sort of dismantling of certain agencies, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, for example, or even just in the last couple of weeks, we had Donald Trump add his name to the Kennedy Center building. And, when you're talking about normalization, I guess, do you see this sort of, whether it's collusion, marriage, cooperation between state and corporate interests, getting any better? Because it seems like if it has essentially 4 years, at least 2 years plus 2 more to flesh itself out, that we might be at a point of no return.
we are at a point of no return. There is no return from, and right, the merging of state and corporate interests is of course a signature a sign of fascism. But we are at a point of no return. What are we going to return to? I mean, how would you reimpose? Any future president can become make billions of dollars now. What are you going to say? You're going to say, suddenly the rules apply again. The future of the United States is very, very unclear. The reputation of the United States is in tatters. America is very unpopular. America will never stand for democracy again. America stands for cruelty and white supremacy right now in the world. Inside America, the banks, Jamie Dimon, it was reported today, has made over has something like $700 million in compensation. The billionaire, people are just gobbling up the money, the profits. And we have this classical structure of throwing, cultural meat to poor men, and then just the corporations and the oligarchs gobbling up the money. How do you return from this level of corruption? I don't see how you can return from it. The question is just how we build something new. There's got to be something new that is built. Mamdani in New York is kind of possibly sketching that. It's got to be something that stands up to this merging of state and corporate interests, but it's got to be something new. There is no return. There has to be some future politician will have to sketch a new vision for America and really some kind of new country.
Professor Jason Stanley from the University of Toronto, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Next, build, baby, build, as they say. That is the White House Silicon Valley slogan, urging companies to invest in artificial intelligence infrastructure inside the United States. And the campaign has so far been very successful, with tens of billions of dollars funneled into data centers across the country. But while these investments may appease President Trump, they are causing major issues for surrounding communities as well as for the environment. Hannah Beckler, investigative reporter at Business Insider, joins Hari Srinivasan to discuss her findings.
Christian, thanks. Hannah Beckler, thanks so much for joining us. You had a recent investigation in Business Insider titled Exposing the Dark Side of America's Data Center Explosion. What surprised you about this investigation?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I think we have all of these big tech companies who are racing to build out a speculative future built on AI. But the impacts that are happening on our communities, our water, our electricity grids are happening right now. So what we really wanted to investigate is what's happening on the ground, what's going on, and how resource intensive is this build out?
For our audience, unless they're watching this conversation live over the air, so to speak, even the YouTube archive of this is part of what is stored in the data center, right? Kind of give us an understanding, I guess, of what these are and what's different about these versus all of these AI-focused data centers that are coming in the future versus the ones we're familiar with today.
So the first thing to understand is that a lot of the data centers, they're used for things like social media, our emails, our applications that we're using every day. So all of that doesn't really exist in a cloud. It exists in data centers, which are these kind of big warehouses full of servers that are sort of processing all of that information, all that data all the time. What's different about data centers that are built to process AI is they are even more power intensive. So they require servers that are just many manifold more power intensive than what we're usually seeing. So we're just seeing a huge escalation in how much electricity these data centers are using.
Okay, and where does that electricity usually come from? If somebody puts one of these data center warehouses into a community, what are they plugging into to get that power?
Well, they're plugging right into the electricity grid, just the same as, our houses and small businesses, that sort of thing. But I think what we're really seeing is that in order to handle the sort of extreme power load, they're often needing to build sort of specialized transmission lines that large scale infrastructure to support that kind of power. And what we're seeing is utilities sort of democratizing those expenses across all the ratepayers. So that means that it's not just the data center, it's, our houses and our small businesses who are paying a little bit more to be able to support that kind of infrastructure.
Okay, and if everybody in the neighborhood, so to speak, is paying for the new transmission line to keep that data center alive and our bills go up, I'm assuming some of these communities are pushing back.
They are. We're starting to see some pushback, places like Georgia and Virginia in particular. Virginia, a filing from Dominion, which is the largest utility company in Virginia, sort of estimated that Virginia ratepayers could be paying as much as 50% more on their electricity bill in order to sort of support broad expansion of the electricity grid in Virginia. So we're starting to see a little pushback. We're starting to see residents say, what's going on here? What does this look like? And regulators are starting to take notice as well.
In response to your investigation, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google told Business Insider that they were committed to paying their full share for upgrades to grid infrastructure like high voltage power lines. Is that the case for the 1,200 data centers that are out there? Because these are just kind of a couple of the companies. Are there companies and municipalities with all kinds of different policies and expectations?
I think those companies really dominate electricity use nationwide. So it's meaningful that they are at least saying that they are committed to paying their full fair share. The problem is that when we look at the actual regulatory filings, we're still seeing a number of data centers. For example, there was one in Georgia recently, a QTS facility, and they're submitting regulatory filings asking for a $300 million transmission line that's being built out there. And that cost will be displaced against all the ratepayers in that area. So it can be really difficult to measure these things and exactly how much data centers are actually paying for the massive infrastructure build out that is required to support their electricity load.
Okay, and give us an idea of how widespread this is. I know in your story, you guys had a map and there were a lot of little dots all over the country.
So I think what was really striking is in around 2010, we were seeing about 311 data centers. That was nationwide. And then by the end of last year, that number had nearly quadrupled to 1,240 data centers. So it's a massive expansion in pretty short amounts of time. And they're mostly concentrated in Virginia, but we're starting to see some other hotspots. So in Maricopa County, for example, in Arizona, or in the central Ohio area.
Okay, when you talk about Arizona, one of the things that automatically, like an alarm bell goes off for me, which is kind of the water table there. And one of the things that you point out is that it's not just electricity that these data centers use, but they also use water. How so?
So in order to keep your servers running, you have to keep them cool. They're running 24/7, so they get really, really hot. They generate a lot of heat. So you need to have something that's going to be, taking away that excess heat. A common system is to use fresh drinking water to be able to sort of run it through the data center and cool off those servers. So some of the very, very largest facilities, they're being built in places like Arizona, where we're already seeing extreme water stress and a lot of drought. And they're competing directly with residents there because they're using fresh drinking water to be able to cool those servers.
And what's the incentive that towns and municipalities around the country have to try to lure the data centers in? I'm assuming that there's a benefit that they're saying, okay, well, we want this data center in our area.
So what we found is 3 dozen states have state level sort of incentives where they're giving sort of 100% sales and use tax abatements to data centers, which is really significant when you're thinking about the amount of investment that is going into building these centers. And then on top of that, municipalities or counties are also offering significant incentives for data centers. So they're saying you can get 100% property tax abatements, for example, for 15 years, which is really striking. What data centers are saying and their operators are saying is this is an opportunity for these areas to sort of transform their economies into high-tech economies where there's lots of high-paying jobs. The reality that what we found is that 80% of data center jobs are in their construction. And once they're actually fully built, you're only seeing, maybe as few as 25 full-time permanent jobs at each facility. So they don't really employ that many workers.
When you looked at this, you had to figure out how much electricity these data centers were going to be using? How did you do that?
Complicated. So many of these operators, they don't really want to disclose how much power their fleet of data centers is using at any one time. So we actually followed our own methodology, which we developed in very close consultation with many academics, engineers, and industry insiders. So we used the air permits. So these are regulatory permits that are issued to the backup generators that each data center has. So data centers can never be without power. So they're always built with these backup diesel generators. And those diesel generators are a point of pollution. So they're regulated by state departments of environment. So we went and requested from all 50 states and DC for those permits issued to data center backup generators. So it's a bit of a couple step process here, but that's how we were able to extrapolate our estimate electricity use. Is we added up the amount of power those generators are able to produce. We applied sort of a redundancy estimate. So you always build more generators than you actually use. And then estimated the amount of what's called capacity, which is how much, power or how much use are those servers running at any one time. So somewhat complicated, but we're able to estimate a range of what these data center we estimate their electricity use is.
And put that in perspective for us. How much power are data centers going to be drawing in the United States if all of these come online?
So by the end of 2024, if all of those permitted data centers are built and constructed and come online, we're estimating that their power use in total could be as much as Ohio, the entire state of Ohio used in 2023 on the low end. And on the high end, it could be as much as Florida used in 2023. So it's a really massive amount of power. A federal estimate actually puts that far higher. So by 2028, they estimate that data centers could be using as much as 600 terawatt hours of electricity each year, which is 12% of what the US uses each year. So it would be a significant amount of power.
There was a study that was estimating that AI-driven data centers could consume 1.7 trillion gallons of water every year by 2027 around the world. In Oregon, there was a local newspaper that found that the Google data centers in the Dalles had used 355 million gallons. They put it in the context of roughly 500 Olympic-sized swimming pools. It's just, I don't think people understand and the scale of the kinds of water we're talking about or the scale of the kinds of electricity. I mean, when you talk to different researchers, how concerned were they?
Very concerned. So something that we identified is that as many as 43% of data centers, and these are our largest data centers, are constructed in areas where we're already seeing extreme water stress. And what that means is there's not enough available water for the residents that are already there. I think what's also really unique about data centers is unlike other sort of water-intensive industries, data centers are using drinking water. So that means, again, that they are competing directly with residents who need that drinking water to just survive in the desert. For example, some of these data centers that are built in Maricopa County, it's in the desert. So water is a precious and finite resource.
Who owns most of the data centers that are coming out? How did you find that out?
So sometimes the permits are issued directly to the companies. It's very clear, but in many cases, they are issued to shell LLCs. So we had spent a lot of time looking at other regulatory filings, both at the state and federal level, to sort of match those LLCs to their parent company. Once we did that, it was pretty clear the most data centers are operated by Amazon. So by the end of 2024, they had 177 data centers by our count. And then we looked at, again, how power intensive these data centers are. And the top 5 probably won't surprise most people. They're the big tech companies that are investing billions of dollars into data center expansion. But it's Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Meta, and QTS.
Microsoft, they said that they remain committed to developing and supporting innovative solutions to reduce emissions, focusing on long-term solutions. Amazon, which you mentioned, they said they aim to reach net zero carbon emissions across their operations by 2040. Meta said they're committed to fostering the long-term vitality of the communities where they operate. QTS, which is a company that most people haven't heard of, but that owns a lot of these data centers, as you point out, said 100% of QTS centers constructed since 2018 consumed no water for cooling. And then Google, they said they reduced their data center energy emissions by 12% in 2024, despite significant growth in electricity demand. So, you spoke to a lot of different people that were kind of living in the neighborhoods where these data centers are coming now or they're planning to come. What were the concerns that they had as, I guess, neighbors?
So what you have to imagine is these facilities are, first of all, they're enormous. Many of them are very, very large. They operate 24/7. So what that means is that they have these large industrial cooling fans that are operating constantly. And those fans are loud. They emit sort of a loud, sort of buzzing, droning noise that's so loud that when we spoke to some residents who their houses are built, just a couple hundred feet away, that constant noise, it's shaking their windows. One resident told us that he had to move his family into the basement in order to try to escape the noise to be able to sleep. So it's sort of an omnipresent fixture of their lives now.
In response to one of the people that you were talking to in your story, Amazon said that we saw a meaningful reduction in the noise from the improvements, basically mufflers on fans, taller exhaust vents, and they now are operating well below ordinance. Considering that we are heading into a future that seems to include artificial intelligence, why should, I guess, general Americans be concerned about this kind of abstract notion that we're talking about, these larger infrastructure costs? Because most of us are just getting used to, oh, hey, look, I can just do this great little search on my phone and it works. So I don't have a data center next to me. Why should I care?
I think what we're seeing is a dramatic expansion in data centers that are already having a dramatic impact on our grids, our electricity, our environment, the clean air that we, enjoy, and the clean drinking water near our communities. So, many of these companies, again, are pouring hundreds of billions of dollars that may amount to as much as $1 trillion in capital expenditures in the next couple of years alone. So the kind of build out that we're seeing is on a scale that we frankly have never really seen before in this country. Some people have really equated it to something like the Industrial Revolution or how the railroads were expanded across the US. So we're seeing a huge amount of investment in something that, again, remains to be seen if it's actually going to pay off. It's incredibly speculative, but big tech companies are betting big on that speculative future built on AI. Again, the impacts, though, are happening right now. We're seeing how utilities are moving away from planned green energy, such as solar and wind power, to keep more sort of coal-fired plants or natural gas-fired plants running. So that's, again, it's going to have, a really outsized impact on climate change, for example. And it's also having an impact, again, on our water, where we live, our communities nationwide, as these continue to be expanded across the country.
So what is the role of government to try to regulate this? I mean, maybe give us some perspective from one administration to the next, or as these projects keep rolling out, is there regulation somewhere that we should look at as a model? Is there regulation that's failing somewhere that we should try to avoid?
Well, it's been interesting to look at it historically. So when you're looking at 2017, for example, some of these very giant data centers are going into Ohio. Ohio regulators are allowing the utility, for example, to give them what they call economic development rates. So meaning that a company like Meta might actually pay a cheaper electricity rate in order to kind of build their data center. So you go from that perspective in 2017 to as recently as this year, we're seeing regulators actually think, we need to add additional riders onto these data centers to make sure that they're paying their fair share for those transmission costs, that we're not displacing the electricity cost onto residents and small businesses in the nearby areas, that data centers are paying their fair share for electricity costs. So we are starting to see some regulatory efforts taking shape in Ohio, and Virginia and Georgia. So kind of remains to be seen if those same regulations are adopted nationwide.
Is this just the cost of doing business in a future with AI?
Great question. I think the problem is that none of us really know. So much of this, again, is speculative. We're not seeing the payout that we'd expect to see in economies or how it's transforming sort of our work life in the same way that some of these big tech companies are promising. What we are seeing, though, is a dramatic change in how our electricity is produced, how the impact on the environment is, our electricity costs, the amount of clean water we have. So I think we just have to really think, yeah, maybe this is the cost of doing business if we want this future built on AI, but is that cost too high?
Investigative reporter with Business Insider, Hannah Beckler. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, President Trump says he has no plans to fire the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, despite the Justice Department's criminal investigation against him over a $2.5 billion renovation project of the central bank. Powell hit back, saying the move is political retribution for not following Trump's orders to cut interest rates. Trump denies any prior knowledge of the inquiry, and Powell has garnered support from fellow central bankers and Republican lawmakers too. Co-anchor of CNBC Squawk Box, Andrew Ross Sorkin, joins Walter Isaacson now to discuss the threat to the bank's independence with this unprecedented investigation.
Thank you, Christian and Andrew Ross Sorkin. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So earlier this week, I wake up as I usually do to your Deal Book newsletter, and there was a sentence that sort of jolted me more than my chicory coffee. It was right after Fed Chair Jay Powell released a video saying he was under criminal investigation, and you wrote, "There are certain moments that deserve extra reflection. Today is one of them." Why is this such a big deal?
You know, I think for the last year that we've watched this administration, we've seen all sorts of elements of what might be described as lawfare and questions about that. You know, there's also been questions about the independence of the Federal Reserve for the last year, as the president has made it clear that Jay Powell is his enemy and somebody he would like to fire and push out. And I think this was one of those moments, especially within the business world, that was different. It's been one thing in the past, in history, there have been moments when presidents have been quite critical, more than critical publicly, about the head of the Federal Reserve and the acts of the Federal Reserve. But this was different. This is the very idea of potentially prosecuting on a criminal basis the head of the Federal Reserve. And it comes at a moment when the public and the markets look at that and say that it appears to be a coercive act, which is to say, to force Jay Powell to lower interest rates or to otherwise leave from his term before his term is over. And I've long waited thinking, is a moment like this going to even come? And by the way, when a moment like this comes, what is going to happen next? Will political leaders, will business leaders stand up and say something?
And have they?
It's been interesting. There have been a number of folks, who, both in the Republican Party, in the Senate, that have broken with this president over this issue and done so publicly. All of the living former Fed chairs that have been in this role came out and condemned this action and this investigation and supported Jay Powell. Similarly, a number of former Treasury secretaries, including Henry Paulson, a Republican, said the same thing. And then most recently, we heard from Jamie Dimon, one of the most influential bank CEOs in America, publicly support Jay Powell and the independence of the Fed as well. So I think you are actually seeing some voice to this, and not just some voice to this from the individuals themselves, but even the market has had a voice of a sort, insofar as when this first became public on Sunday evening, the markets moved and did so negatively in reaction to it.
When this happened in 2018, when Trump was saying, I'm going to fire Powell, the markets moved a whole lot. Tell me, though, what's really happening now in the markets? It's even gone down a bit. Maybe Bitcoin or gold is doing something, but are they really reacting?
Well, I think there's a combination of things. One is there's been a numbing. There's been a numbing effect in terms of just so many norms that have been shattered. To some degree, I think that people in the market don't flinch the way they might have in the past. The other element is, in part because we've seen such a vocal reaction, I think the markets have settled themselves and said, well, maybe in fact there won't be a quote unquote prosecution of Jay Powell. There has been commentary from some senators, Republican senators in Washington. They may even hold up the next nominee from Trump to be the head of the Fed, unless this investigation ends in some kind of very quick way. So I do think the markets are taking some solace from that in the context of what does the independence of the Fed look like?
Well, you said that some Republicans are pushing back and saying they may hold up nominees. The really big one is Tom Tillis of North Carolina. A few others, Senator Kennedy from my home state of Louisiana, others have said it. But Tom Tillis was very strong. Let me read some of it, which is, if there were any remaining doubt whether advisors within the Trump administration are actively pushing to end the independence of the Federal Reserve, there should now be none. And then he said the credibility of the Justice Department is the one that's in trouble and that he's going to hold things up. Do you think this means the dam may be breaking, that this notion that Republican senators haven't stood up to Trump might be ending?
I don't know. This could be a very idiosyncratic moment. Tillis is not running for re-election, in part because he's fed up with what's happened in Washington. And so he has potentially more license, if you will, than others to perhaps speak his mind. There's also been some reporting just in the past 24 hours from the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere that the president was putting pressure on Pam Bondi and other members of the Department of Justice to try to exact the kind of cases and bring the kinds of cases and do the work that he's been pushing for and demonstrating his frustration about that. And some people have been led to believe that perhaps some of those conversations, in fact, led to the beginning of this investigation in terms of subpoenas being sent and the like.
Let's follow that up. You just said it may be the pressure. Was that what happened in this investigation with the U.S. attorney who's close to Trump?
I think we don't know the answer yet. Thus far, the president, and I should say this as clearly as he has said it, he says that he did not know about this investigation, that he had not spoken with the Department of Justice about this investigation and learned of it like everybody else. I cannot verify that. I do not know if that is the case, but I think it is clear that we've heard his public commentary about Jay Powell over these past months. And not just that, we've also seen and heard the kind of close relationship and back and forth he has had with different people who work within the Department of Justice. So I think there are still questions about, what led to this in truth, and whether the president specifically said to his colleagues at the Department of Justice, please go do this, or they felt pressure to do it to appease him. They may be one and the same in the end.
Well, let's be clear what Chairman Powell thinks. I mean, what he said was the threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. So he's pretty clear. And doesn't it make sense that he kind of knows why this is happening?
Well, look, there's two views of his decision to publicly release that video, which is really unprecedented for a Federal Reserve chair. One is that indeed, in fact, he very much believes that this is lawfare and that this is being used as a coercive effort to push him out early or to influence how he reacts. And there is another view that his decision to go public in such a way is to shape perhaps the narrative. And obviously the president and the Department of Justice have suggested that they believe that they are bringing this case in good faith, or this investigation, I should say, in good faith. They have said that they sent two letters or communications to the Federal Reserve. I believe those communications happened in December, asking for more information, and did not receive anything.
Yeah, but I mean, this is just something about a construction of a building. This is not a criminal case that seems to make sense.
Well, that's the thing. Look, there are lots of different avenues for the American public and Congress and others to hold the Federal Reserve and other institutions in the United States accountable, if you will, for spending. So if the issue is how are they spending the money, clearly in this case, there is demonstrable evidence that it is something like $700 million over budget. If there was evidence that this was being misused and lied about, you don't have to have a criminal investigation to find out more. You could hold hearings. You could have auditors go in. There are other things you can do. A criminal investigation is a very specific thing to do and carries enormous consequences.
How do you think this might affect interest rates in the Fed, what it's going to do later in the month?
Oh, goodness. In truth, I actually think this is creating potentially more independence for the Fed, at least temporarily, insofar that there could be a backlash. I think there are members of the Fed and also, by the way, other central bankers from around the world that have now come out in support of Jay Powell and this Federal Reserve. So the idea of trying to either kick him out or change his view, I think, in fact, it will be strengthened to some degree. And not only was there an expectation that Jay Powell would leave his seat in May as the chair, but there was also the possibility that he would retire from the board entirely. He could stay on as a governor. And in fact, perhaps because of what's just happened, it may be more likely that he does stay on for some period of time.
Let me ask you the most basic question. Why shouldn't the president be able to help decide what interest rates are? Why should the Fed be totally independent? Why shouldn't we have some political control where we decide to hold the president accountable if there's inflation?
I think in the end, history has demonstrated that you need to have an independent Federal Reserve, in part because they are setting interest rates, and they need to be able to do so without fear or favor, without trying to get whoever's in office elected by lowering interest rates temporarily or raising interest rates temporarily. And even more importantly than that, I would actually argue in a crisis, in a panic moment, having written about 1929 and having written about 2008 and even what the Federal Reserve ultimately did during the pandemic, oftentimes the Federal Reserve has to do things that are uniquely politically unpopular and unpalatable. The bailouts in 2008, I know there's lots of debate about that, but ultimately, arguably, it helped keep the country from really getting into a long depression. Similarly, during the pandemic, there was an effort to really throw money at the problem, which could have been politically unpalatable in that moment. And yet you need a Federal Reserve that's willing to do things without fear that the President of the United States or any other politician is going to be trying to, move the dials.
In your book, 1929, you have a lot of wonderful characters, but one of them is Senator Carter Glass of Virginia, who helps create the Fed. Tell me about the compromises done that created the Fed and why that either makes it stronger or more vulnerable today.
Well, so one of the keys to the Federal Reserve was to have an important and central office in Washington, but was also to have regional offices around the country so that Wall Street didn't take over, didn't have more power. That was critical. And the independence piece was also critical. And they were aware of that because they understood that there were going to be decisions that at times were going to be politically unpopular. And when you really dig in and even think about the crash of 1929 and look at the fact that, frankly, the Fed did not act perhaps the way they should have, one of the reasons for that, arguably, if you read some of the diaries and notes and memos of the members of the board during that period, was because of political pressure. Because the Federal Reserve was such a new entity, born in 1913, still considered an experiment of sorts, there was a worry that if they actually raised interest rates to try to tamp down speculation, that they could tip the economy over and they would get blamed. And not just that they get blamed, but that the entire experiment would be eliminated.
Tell me about what we can learn from overseas. I know that the Turkish president has interfered with his central bank. Is that a warning sign for us?
There's no question that there have been a whole number of instances where you've seen certain countries, some of which have been described as banana republics and others, where the head of state effectively has tried to manage the economy and manage their central bank. And in some of those cases, you have seen massive inflation spikes, in part because the investor class says this is not as trustworthy a borrower as we thought, given that the controls are not independent.
Let me ask you something, a separate thing, which is the cap on credit card interest rates. How does that play into this, and is this causing Wall Street to have more agita?
Well, this is a separate but very complicated issue. It comes against the backdrop of the watchword of the day in our economy, which is affordability, and the President of the United States really taking a page, frankly, from the Democrats. In fact, President Trump almost teaming up to some degree with Elizabeth Warren in this case to suggest that banks should cap their credit card rates at 10% as a way to try to make things more affordable for Americans, so those that are not able to pay off their monthly bills are not being charged 15, 20, in some cases as much as 30 or more percent each month. Now, there's a battle going on here because while it sounds on the headline, oh, it's going to be capped at 10%, that sounds good. There are real questions in the marketplace right now, and a lot of what the banks are saying is it could really eliminate or reduce the amount of credit that's available to borrowers, which is to say that the banks may cut off certain customers because they would find them to be, quote unquote, unprofitable and couldn't make the economics of those credit cards work.
Well, all of this ties in, it seems to me, to sort of a more populist Donald Trump talking about affordability like Democrats have been doing, and that even comes to the question of corporate buying of housing. Is this all of a piece of a new Donald Trump?
Oh, I think that there's a line running through all of these things. I think it's the piece on credit cards. It's trying to eliminate big private equity companies from buying homes and then turning around and trying to sell or rent them to individuals to try to keep prices lower there. Even an effort to eliminate or reduce the number of stock buybacks that take place and dividends in the country. So there is a move afoot that actually looks a lot like what some Democrats have supported for a very, very long time, and is an interesting in terms of the timing ahead of the midterms.
And it's all part of a populist piece. And do you think this will finally change President Trump's relationship with the people you cover, the people in the backdrop of you right there, which is basically Wall Street, the markets, business, and corporate America?
So that's where I'm less clear. I will say, in this moment where the Republicans control the White House, Congress, and the Senate, there's always a question of who is the governor, if you will, over the President of the United States. And from my vantage point, actually, the market has been perhaps one of the only real governors over the president. And I say that because if you remember last April, quote unquote, Liberation Day, the day that the president announced his tariff plan, the bond market really reacted negatively. And then he pulled back. Again, in the fall, we had a similar situation. He talked about much higher tariffs for China. The market reacted and he pulled back. There are very few times and very few people on an individual level in Washington or elsewhere that seem to have forced the hand of the president the way the markets have.
Andrew Ross Sorkin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, whilst political turmoil continues to cause domestic chaos in the United States, the Democratic Party is fighting its own battles with internal tensions mounting, including in the Democratic National Committee, raising the question of whether it can actually be a successful opposition party through Trump's second presidency. The newly elected chair of the DNC, Ken Martin, has plenty of ideas, and he joins Michelle Martin to discuss them.
Ken Martin, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me, Michelle.
Obviously, when we arranged to have this conversation some time ago, our plan was to talk about your plans for the Democratic National Committee, to talk about some of the disagreements that Democrats have been having. But then, of course, over the last few days, we were confronted with the horrific murder of State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband, and also the wounding of State Senator John Hoffman and his wife. Thankfully, they seem to be recovering. But, you've known her for a long time. You're the former chair of the party in Minnesota. So if you would just give me a memory of Representative Hortman, a longstanding Speaker of the House, in fact, one of the longest serving, and undertook that position at a relatively young age. So what is your most significant memory of her?
Well, thank you, Michelle, for asking. And let me just say that obviously as a proud Minnesotan, my heart breaks obviously for all of my friends and colleagues back home in Minnesota. Imagine, waking up to the news on Saturday, as I did and many Minnesotans, that there had been a shooting in Minnesota, only to find out later that it was at the homes of some legislators, and then only to find out later in the day that two of your very close friends, Melissa and Mark Hortman, who I've known over half of my life, were assassinated. And two of my other friends they attempted to murder them as well. And Melissa Hortman was an amazing change maker in our state. She won in 2004, came into the legislature and immediately started to climb the ranks. In 2018, when we won back the House majority, she became the Speaker, one of our longest serving speakers, and frankly, one of the most consequential. When Tim Walz was put on the ticket by Kamala Harris last fall, the first call he made after getting the news was to Speaker Hortman. And what he said is, thank you. Thank you for all you did, because if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be on the ticket. And that's true, because so much of the remarkable legislation that passed in Minnesota, commonly referred to as the Minnesota Miracle, she was the architect of it. She was the person who not only pushed for it, but was persistent and relentless in making sure that other Democrats understood that power is fleeting, and that when you have power, you have to use it to make the biggest difference for as many people as you could. And so truly, she leaves an amazing legacy, a remarkable legacy that's going to impact generations of Minnesotans to come. And it's so devastating on a very personal level to lose someone I was so close to. But for the state, she was such an amazing leader. And our heart breaks. All Minnesotans, regardless of party, are just in pain right now. And I wish I was back home with them.
I would imagine so. Like you and like so many other people, I woke up to this news and, at first I was shocked. But then I thought, should I be shocked? I mean, if you think about it, over the last, months and few years, there were 2 assassination attempts directed at now President Trump. The governor of Pennsylvania's home was firebombed in the middle of the night while his family slept, not to mention the January 6th mob attack on the Capitol. So I guess what I'm saying is it's shocking on the one hand, but is it really shocking?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question, Michelle. And the reality is I hear people say in both this weekend and even before that, this is not who we are as America. I would say, unfortunately, this is who we are, but it's not who we should be. It's not who we need to be, meaning that we all have a responsibility. If you reject this type of violence and you don't want to see any more of it, we should acknowledge that this is who we've become as a country. But it does not mean this is permanent. It does not mean this is who we need to be. It requires all of us in this moment, Michelle, to speak out against political violence of any form or any kind.
So let me go back to what you think your role is right now. I don't know that, I would assume that you didn't run for the chairman of the Democratic National Committee so that you would be kind of offering condolences to the country at a time like this. But unfortunately, this is your task right now. But on a broader sense, what do you see as your role as chairman of one of the great, political parties in America?
Well, we're the oldest political party in this country, in the oldest and longest enduring democracy in the world. My role and responsibility right now is singular, and that's to win elections, to put us back into power, to actually help us stop this tyrant in the White House and what they're doing to destroy the values of this great country. And so what does that look like, of course? And, for me, it's a fierce focus on building the infrastructure everywhere. Our philosophy here is very simple. When you organize everywhere, you can win anywhere. And as a result, we've already started doing that. I'm 4 months on the job, Michelle, and we have overperformed or won in almost every special election on the ballot since Donald Trump was inaugurated. There's a huge opportunity in every crisis. And right now, that opportunity is that we can expand our coalition to many people in this country right now who either left our party, supported Donald Trump and are having buyer's remorse, or people who have felt abandoned by our party right now. There's an opportunity to give them hope again that their better days are ahead of them, that the Democratic Party is fighting for them and their families and their communities.
Okay, you use the word crisis. What is the crisis for the Democratic Party? Is it a crisis of brand? Is it a crisis of message? Or is it a crisis of ideas?
I think it's all of it, if I'm being honest with you. But let me start with last spring. There was research, Michelle, that showed for the first time in modern history that the perceptions of the two political parties has flipped, that the majority of Americans now believe that the Republican Party best represents the interests of the middle class, the working class, and the poor, and the Democratic Party is the party of the wealthy and the elites. That is a damning indictment on our party for sure. And certainly, you know this as well as I do, Michelle. Most people in this country do not vote on policy and issues. They vote on perceptions and feelings. And there's many people in this country who are feeling forgotten, who are feeling left behind and feeling like the Democratic Party does not represent them anymore or isn't fighting hard enough for them in their communities. And so, that perception is going to take time to change. And so when I say there's a crisis of brand and identity right now. There's a crisis of perception. And we have to do a better job of giving people a sense that we're going to fight hard for them when we're back in power. And look, in this moment right now, Michelle, when things are so chaotic in Washington, D.C., we also have to stand up and fight against Donald Trump. The reality is in 2016, someone said to me that the Republicans are shameless, but the Democrats are spineless. If we're not willing to stand up and fight hard against Donald Trump right now, how do we believe that the American voters are going to think that we would fight for them and their families if they put us back in power? But more importantly, I ask this question everywhere I go to Democrats. If we're not willing to stand up and fight like hell for the things we believe in, then the question is, do we really believe in them at all?
So whose fault is this?
I think it's everyone's fault. All of us who've been involved in this for many years. The reality is, Michelle, this is, not a singular occurrence of one election. We've been losing ground with people for years.
Because why? Because
right.
Why?
Yeah, well, why I think is, there's a multitude of factors of why we've been losing ground, right? I would argue one is how we campaign. Right? We show up 3 to 4 months before an election. The first conversation we have with voters is asking them to do something for our party and candidates, which is to vote for us. Then we don't show up for 2 years again. And at the same time, we have the same conversation. And so voters don't believe that we actually care about them as people, as humans, that we don't really invest in their communities, that we're not invested in their success, right? And so, part of it is how we campaign. We need year-round organizing like we have in Minnesota, where the first conversation we have with voters is not transactional, but it's asking voters what their hopes and dreams are for their communities and eventually building a relationship around shared values. And only after we've earned the right to ask for their vote, asking them to vote for our party and candidates. And so that, I would argue, one of the reasons we've lost is because of the way we treat voters and their communities as just commodities. The second reason I think we've lost trust is because when we get into office, we don't actually deliver on the promises we made.
So here's where I have to jump in here and just ask, a lot of your first 4 months in office has been taken up with, or at least that we publicly see, disputes with other members of the party, people like the outgoing vice chair, David Hogg. Some of what you're saying about Democrats sort of over-promising and under-delivering is exactly what he's been saying. So what's the source of the tension here?
Yeah, look, I've never had an issue with what David Hogg is talking about. I think primaries are really important. I think it's important to hold elected officials accountable, and I also think it's important to have primaries so we bring new voices into the party process. But let me be very clear. I pushed a neutrality pledge long before David Hogg was ever involved in Democratic politics. In 2017, after the 2016 election, I was the author of the superdelegate reform on the Rules and Bylaws Committee, and I also brought a neutrality pledge forward at that time because I believe actually the way we win is by expanding our coalition through addition, not subtraction. And that
neutrality pledge means what? That people who are part of the party apparatus shouldn't take sides in primaries?
Party officers should not be putting their thumb on the scale and picking winners or losers. Our job is to stay out of primary fights and let the will of the primary voters prevail. And then whoever they choose, without interference from party bosses, right, then we work like hell to get elected. Why does that matter to me? Because just like David, I believe we win through addition, not subtraction. We win by bringing people into the party, not by pushing them out. And that's how I've always led it.
Well, what was so dangerous about his idea? I mean, David Hogg is a young man who first came to public attention as a survivor of the Parkland High School shooting in Florida, which is where he went, and became active, as a lot of young people have, around the issue of gun violence because they are so directly affected in school shootings, which have also tragically become, commonplace. Okay, he's gone to college. He ran for this position in the party and had this notion of creating a PAC to try to encourage, to challenge incumbents who he felt or who people in the PAC felt were underperforming. Why is that such a bad idea, in your opinion?
I didn't say it was a bad idea. And I think what's important to understand is that you can't do both. You can't be the referee when your job is to actually create a fair and level playing field for all candidates and, frankly, their supporters, right? Without interference from party bosses, and then also be involved in a PAC that, in fact, is involved in primaries. You just can't do both. This was not a question of impugning his motives or what he's trying to do at all. Only to say that we also have a responsibility as party leaders. Our chief responsibility is to stay out of primaries because it's not up to us to influence it one way or another for an incumbent or a challenger. Our job is to stay out. Why is it important to stay out? It's because we don't want supporters of candidates to feel like their voice didn't matter, that they didn't have an opportunity to be heard, that they didn't have an opportunity to fairly compete for our party nomination. And if there's anything that's going to help us grow the party and bring new voices in, especially voices of younger people who are disillusioned with the party, it's making sure that party bosses are not putting their thumbs on the scale in any way, shape, or form. And so this is not about impugning David's motives at all. I'm a big fan of David Hogg's. Right? This has never been about David Hogg. Just the opposite. This has been about my longstanding belief, right, for many years that our party should be neutral in primaries and that our party should be inclusive.
I understand your point, but David Hogg was elected to that position just as you were. And if that's a different vision of other people in the party, I understand that you have a strong view of the matter, but he was elected just like you were. Why not just let it play out? And say that's your vision.
It did play out. It did play out, and David decided to resign his position before there was another vote.
A CBS News YouGov poll found that 71% of Democrats and 78% of Americans overall think the party has been ineffective in standing up to Trump. Focus groups led by Anat Shenker-Osorio found voters liken Republicans to lions and Democrats to sloths. So how do you shed that image of, passivity and show that the party can fight?
You got to get out there and fight. You got to grow a spine. People got to throw a punch, right? I mean, just a few weeks ago when there was a child who died of measles in Texas, I sent out a tweet that said Robert Kennedy murdered another child. The first people to complain, of course, were Democrats, right?
What did they complain about? What did they say?
Well, I'll tell you what some of them said. Well, we've got to preserve the option to work with these folks. We shouldn't be so aggressive in our messaging. I will tell you this. Now is not the time, when we see what's happening in this country, for Democrats to worry about offending someone, to throw a punch and then pull it back because we use the wrong words. You think that Republicans have any compunction when they get into office? No. They rush forward with their agenda. And at the end of the day, they don't care about offending Democrats or even working with Democrats. Now, look, Michelle, I'm not suggesting at the end of the day that we have to stoop to their level, that we have to lie, we have to exchange misinformation and disinformation. But gosh darn it, we do have to throw a punch. We do have to get out there and fight for our values. We do have to give people a sense that we actually are going to fight for them in their communities, because that's part of the reason why you see research like that. They don't believe the Democratic Party is actually going to stand up and fight hard for what they believe in. And at the end of the day, that contributes to those perceptions and feelings that the Democratic Party has abandoned them and their families.
And what about on something like immigration, where, some of the behavior that this administration is engaging in is distasteful to many Americans, but other people agree with it. How would you recommend that Democrats navigate that?
Well, look, Democrats have said that we need border security. In fact, President Biden and others negotiated out with the most Republican conservative member of the U.S. Senate, and James Langford from Oklahoma last year, a bipartisan deal to actually bring forward strict border security and immigration reform. Who killed that bill? Donald Trump. Donald Trump and the Republicans walked away from it. And guess what? They now have complete unified control of government. Where is their immigration bill? Where is their immigration policy to actually make sure that we have border security?
Well, they argue that their policy is mass deportation. That's not a secret. I mean, that's what they're doing. So
right, but my point is that policy is chaotic. It's dysfunctional. It's not actually helping us solve the issue on the border in any meaningful way. And the point that I'm trying to make to you is that, yes, the Republicans can talk all they want about actually putting policies forward. But what we're seeing on the streets, when you're rounding up people indiscriminately, right? When you are essentially creating chaos around this issue, it's not a long-term solution. It might make you feel good to round people up and say you're deporting them. But look what's happening around this country. Even Donald Trump and the Republicans are losing ground on this issue because they don't believe that this is the right way to deal with immigration and to deal with deportation. We as a party, of course, we're ready and willing to have the conversation about immigration policy in this country and, of course, border security. The Republicans refuse to do it, and instead what they're doing is just inflicting chaos and dysfunction throughout this country through these mass deportations that aren't going to actually solve the issue. It's making it worse.
Ken Martin, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for talking with us. I do hope we'll talk again.
Thank you, Michelle.